9. Sha Gustav. If you ever want to talk about a crazy weapon from the Second World War, then you don't have to look much further than the Sha Gustav. It was built by Germany during the late 1930s and was an 80-centimeter wide railway gun. These types of guns are large artillery pieces that are typically mounted on and transported by the railways. Sha Gustav was developed by the Germans so they could target France's Maginot Line. This region consisted of a series of fortifications, installations, and obstacles the French built to try and ward Germany away from their country. If the enemy was going to get through France, then they'd have to smash the Maginot Line with a powerful weapon. Sha Gustav was seriously nothing to laugh at. The device weighed over 1,300 tons and was about 155 feet in length. The barrel alone stretched over 107 feet. This massive weapon fired an artillery shell with a caliber of 31 inches, or around 800 millimeters. So, exactly how dangerous was this thing? The Sha Gustav could fire shells weighing 7 tons and was able to hit targets at a maximum range of 29 miles. The Sha Gustav was also able to fire a heavy concrete piercing shell as well as a lighter high explosive shell. Sha Gustav never actually saw action against the French, but it was still used against the Soviets in 1942. It was not a simple task getting this massive weapon from Germany all the way to the Soviet Union. It was sent to be used at the Siege of Sevastopol, an important city located in Crimea. The Germans had to build a secondary railway line just to move the Sha Gustav and position it into action. About 2,000 to 4,000 Germans were employed to build this extra railway line. A mind-boggling 500 men were needed just to fire the weapon, which took anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to load. Unbelievable considering what we're used to nowadays. The Sha Gustav was aimed at Sevastopol, and it reportedly fired an astonishing 30,000 tons of artillery. Near the end of the war, the weapon was destroyed by the Germans as the Allied forces advanced deeper into the country. There are rumors that the Soviets discovered pieces of the gun and used the information gathered from them in their own weapons research. Did you know that the term shell-shocked was officially coined during World War I? The constant bombardment was simply too much for soldiers to handle at the time. This constant state of panic led to many soldiers living on the edge. They eventually grew hypersensitive to certain sounds. Some of the men even lost both their sense of smell and taste. Some couldn't sleep, and others even ended up becoming mute, no longer able to speak a single word. A few soldiers even had the infamous 1,000-yard stare, where there's essentially an absolute blank expression on one's face. 8. The Zar Cannon. If we're doing a video on artillery, then we have to discuss some of the more infamous cannons. The biggest and most mind-boggling one is the Zar Cannon. This cannon was cast in bronze during the 16th century and is currently on display in the grounds of the Kremlin in Moscow, Russia. This is still a favorite for tourists to view when they visit. Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, or Fyodor I, was the ruler of Russia during 1586 when the Zar Cannon was initially cast in bronze. It has intricate details and includes the inscription, "The grace of God, Tsar and Great Duke Fyodor Ivanovich, autocrat of all Russia." The cannon sits on top of a carriage that was also finely designed and even features a lion's head. This mammoth cannon weighs well over 86,000 pounds and is well over 17 feet long. The barrel alone measures 35 inches. Instead of firing cannonballs, the Zar Cannon was meant to fire 1,700 pounds of grape shot. While this is also interesting, the Zar Cannon is believed to have been fired only once. 7. Little David. The Germans had several giant guns during World War II, but thankfully so did the United States. The Little David happened to be one of them, and it was no joke. It was a 36-inch caliber mortar designed to blast through the German Siegfried Line, or the West Wall. It was in western Germany near the Netherlands and boasted a series of tank traps, bunkers, and tunnels. It was initially developed to be a beast similar to the Sha Gustav. According to the Veterans Breakfast Club website, Little David fired a 36-inch mortar shell weighing around 3,650 pounds. The mortar was transported in two pieces, the 80,000-pound barrel and the 93,000-pound base. The base would be set to a depth of 13 feet, allowing the barrel to be lowered level to the ground for loading. The Little David required a huge deal of work in order to be set in place. Heavy equipment like bulldozers and cranes were needed just to place its base. A 12-foot pit was then dug, and that pit was supposed to be used for timber. After this, an angled 12-degree entrance ramp was constructed using the wood to bring down the massive base for Little David. The pit was then filled in with dirt before the Little David would be attached to the base. The weapon would be up and ready to fire in a short time, just 12 hours. Once loaded, the Little David could fire its 3,650-pound shell 6 miles away. Test fires of the Little David created giant craters 38 feet in diameter and 13 feet in depth. While the Little David was created to bombard the Germans, it was only in the development stage when Germany finally surrendered. Japan was still at war with the United States though, and it might have been used against the Japanese. But Japan would also surrender not long after. This meant that the Little David was never actually used in battle. Little David was sent to a museum after the war concluded, and has recently been shipped to a new facility, where it'll be restored before being put back on exhibit. What's your artillery of choice? Let us know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. 6. Mallet Mortar. The British developed Mallet Mortar, a siege mortar, way back during the 1850s when they were caught up in the chaos of the Crimean War. Essentially, this conflict was a war where Britain and France decided to side with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. The fighting lasted from 1853 up until 1856. Mallet Mortar was a 36-inch shell gun that was about 11 feet in length and weighed 94,000 pounds. It was designed to fire a shell that weighed somewhere around 2,800 pounds, some 1.7 miles or 2.7 kilometers. Mallet Mortar was tested, but never actually used in any wars. 5. 2B1 Ochre. The 2B1 Ochre was a self-propelled piece of heavy artillery engineered by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It was nothing more than an armored vehicle with a 66-foot or 20-meter barrel. The large size of the barrel made it an incredibly tough weapon to move from one place to another. It could only be fired once every 5 or so minutes. Also, when the 2B1 Ochre was fired, it did damage to its own sprockets and gearbox thanks to the intense recoil. The 2B1 Ochre was perhaps the last of a dying breed of weapon. It was ultimately scrapped in favor of tactical ballistic missiles. Did you know what the biggest cause of death was for those who served in World War I? According to a Smithsonian Magazine article, shrapnel from mortars, grenades, and above all artillery projectile bombs or shells accounted for an estimated 60% of the 9.7 million military deaths of World War I. 4. Mortier de 370 Model 1914 Filou. France's contribution to our list today is the Mortier de 370 Model 1914 Filou. Similar to Mallet Mortar, this was a siege weapon. The French used this weapon during World War I, and they were mobilized once again during the Second World War. The Great War saw the beginnings of trench warfare, and it was up to the artillery to break the enemy's will. Military aircraft at the time were unable to hold bombs, so it was important to develop a large caliber piece of artillery on land somewhere near the battlefield. What's been tough for large artillery weapons is that they have to be transported in several pieces, and the assembly process can be a bit time-consuming. The Mortier de 370 Model 1914 Filou was designed sometime between 1908 and 1912 in France. It weighed 29 tons, and the barrel was 10 feet in length. The Mortier de 370 Model 1914 Filou could fire a 370mm caliber shell 7 miles away. Those weren't lightweight shells either, since they weighed about 1,000 pounds. One of the first uses for the Mortier 370 Model 1914 Filou was coastal artillery. This weapon was seen as extremely valuable against armored warships. But the Mortier 370 Model 1914 Filou was put to use as siege artillery once World War I came around. It was transported through railways, and like the Little David, there was a lot of time and equipment needed to dig a pit so the platform could be placed firmly in the ground. 3. 280mm mortar M1939 BR5. Another Soviet piece of heavy artillery was the 280mm mortar M1939 BR5. It was mainly used during World War II. It had a box trail carriage that allowed for transportation. The 280mm mortar M1939 BR5 had a 16-foot-long barrel and weighed about 40,000 pounds. It fired a 542-pound shell that was 11 inches, and the 280mm mortar M1939 BR5 had an effective firing range of over 6 miles. This weapon was part of the siege artillery used by Soviets during World War II. It officially debuted in 1939 during the Winter War that was held between Finland and the Soviet Union. The 280mm mortar M1939 BR5 did extremely well against heavily armored bunkers and pillboxes. It was used again during the 1940s against Germany, but the weapon was very cumbersome to move, proving ineffective in the long run. Did you know? According to the National World War I Museum, a shell hole left by a 15cm Jack Johnson, a German howitzer named after the famous boxer thanks to its punch, had a diameter of 28 feet across and roughly 6 feet deep in the center. 2. Pomard Von St. The Pomard Von St was a cannon built in Austria. It was used by the Holy Roman Empire centuries ago. The Pomard Von St's history can be traced all the way back to the 15th century, and it's truly a one-of-a-kind bombard. If you're not familiar with the bombard, they were cannons or mortars used during the Middle Ages. Bombards are weapons that later led to the terms bombardier and bombardment. Pomard Von St measured nearly 9 feet in length and weighed 8 tons. This weapon fired an 800mm ball and could hit a target 2,000 feet away. 1. Paris gun. The Paris gun was a German long-range siege weapon used during World War I. The Paris gun was also called the Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz, Kaiser Wilhelm gun. It was an intimidating weapon used mainly by the Germans against the French. The look alone would scare anyone, but it was far from reliable when used on the battlefield. The Paris gun measured over 11 feet in length and weighed a whopping 256 tons. According to online sources, the gun was capable of firing a 106-kilogram shell to a range of 130 kilometers and a maximum altitude of 42.3 kilometers, the greatest height reached by a human-made projectile until the first successful V-2 flight test in October 1942. The Paris gun was initially used to bombard Paris from 75 miles away. The Germans set up the guns in a city called Crepy before they started firing. The citizens of Paris thought the attack was coming from high up in the sky, but they were horrified to learn that it was actually coming from a long-range weapon. It caused a great deal of destruction in the city. Wikipedia states, the worst incident was on 29 March 1918, when a shell hit the roof of the Saint-Gervais et Saint-Protais church, collapsing the roof onto the congregation, then hearing the Good Friday service. A total of 91 people were killed, and 68 were wounded. Overall, the guns were not very accurate, and their barrels needed to be constantly replaced. The upkeep was simply too much to handle during wartime. When the Americans entered the war, they, the French, and the British were able to push back the Germans. They then took their Paris guns back to Germany, where the weapons were never captured. Do you have any other amazing military weapons you'd like us to make videos about? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!